Hi, guys. It's Mr. Johnston here from AP Art History at Carroll Senior High School. I wanted to take the time today to tell you how excited I am that you're trying to find out more about the course and give you some specifics that you can think about. Normally, if you had a regular AP course, there would be a pre-AP course that would serve as a prerequisite. So it's kind of challenging for us to get the idea across, especially with the two campuses, about this very exciting course. What we'll study basically is what you would expect, architecture, sculpture, and painting. But the course has been through a couple of transitions, and I'll talk more about those here in just a second. But some of you may have seen some of the places that we're going to talk about or some of the artworks that we'll share. So your travels are going to be engaged in the classroom. Every time you've seen something, I want you to say something. So you probably will see some of these in either AP Euro or World History. So whenever there's a cross connection, it's great to speak up. But these are typically the pinnacles of the disciplines they represent. So we're trying to give you kind of an introduction of all the great artworks, whether they be architecture, sculpture, or painting across the periods of history. We will start as early as cave paintings and move our way all the way through the timeline. So there will definitely be a lot to look at. I often tell my kids in class that if you don't like what we're studying right now, just wait. It'll change because we definitely try to take in a little bit of everything. The changes that I mentioned before have to do with the fact that we have a more global world focus now. We're looking at cultures outside of Europe and America quite often. We'll study the Old Kingdom and New Kingdom of ancient Egypt. We will study ancient Near East, the Sumerians, Babylonians, Akkadians, Assyrians, a variety of people that you may already be familiar with from your world history classes. But we'll study the cultures of sub-Saharan Africa, primarily anything but Egypt, right? And go into great detail about the different geographies that help to kind of inform the artworks we see from each culture. We'll talk about Buddhism and Hinduism in South and Southeast Asia. And by the end of the course, you'll be able to read the iconography of what the Buddha is telling you in pictures like that you see here on the screen. We will talk about Mesoamerica, which is primarily Maya, Aztec, or Mexica, and Olmec cultures. We'll talk about South America, where we talk about Chavenda Huantar, as well as the Incas that you probably already know from Machu Picchu and Cusco. Native North Americans will also have their fair share of exposure, so we'll be looking at those guys as well. So we really do attempt to go more global in our framework and look at more than just the traditional survey course in college. For example, we'll look at East Asia. We'll look at China, Korea, Japan. We'll also look at Pacific Rim cultures and Oceania, primarily Melanesia, Micronesia, and Polynesia. So we have a wide array of artworks that give us a great opportunity to talk about the way that artworks are made and are in some ways universal. So there will be lots of compare and contrast as we move along. If you're wondering what art history is good for, well, think about it. It's art plus history. I mean, it's basically thinking about the great things that humans have done over time. And that kind of thinking spurs or inspires different kinds of ideas. I mean, wherever you think you see yourself going, they're going to want you to be able to think about what has already been done and how to make it better. So the idea is that these thinking challenges and applications apply to a lot of different disciplines, whether or not you plan to actually major in art to begin with. If we're talking about specifics, then we're probably going to start by looking at artworks like the Arnolfini portrait here on my right, by talking about the content, the what that we see in the pictures, right? We want to probably identify things like the dog at the feet of the loving couple, or that strange signature on the back wall above a beveled mirror in front of a chandelier. We might want to note that people have their shoes off. All of these are issues of content or what we see as a way to kind of enter the artwork. Where they're going to want to talk about form, how the works are executed or how they're carried out, like the paint strokes, the brush strokes that you see here, or the sculptural forms that a sculptor uses, or the organization of space inside a piece of architecture, primarily discussing things like elements of art and principles of design. So if you've had some studio, we're definitely going to be talking about things you already know. If you haven't, no worries. You'll know them by the end of the course. When we talk about content, we're talking about what. When we talk about form, we're talking about how. Then we move on to things like function. What does the artwork do when it's all said and done? How is it supposed to be read? If any of you know this piece, you realize that it's not just a pretty picture, it's also a wedding contract. So that would be important to your knowledge of how this particular piece works. Context, we're going to definitely talk about the art historical periods that generate these pieces. No artwork that we can ever look at is basically divorced of its art history. So here we would introduce ideals of the early Northern Renaissance and oils on panel that Van Eyck was kind of known for. So those are the specific pieces or parts of the artworks that we look at, and it helps to make something a lot of people think as more subjective, more objective, and those are the things you're held accountable for. We'll also work on different skills like the skill of attribution, where you literally have to look at a work you've never seen before and use your knowledge of content, form, function, and context to figure out who you think it might be and make an argument. For example, if I showed you Claude Monet and the train station at Saint-Lazare, one of his most famous pieces in a series about the changing nature of the urban experience at the end of the 19th century, and probably note his color palette as being those of pastels and sketchy marks, along with some other notes about painting something that's from the everyday. You probably already know this guy without me saying very much at all. Van Gogh's iconic swirly brushstrokes and bright blues and rich yellows. Those are his color palette to basically express what he's feeling about this very emotional night sky. So having had that little bit of exposure, I bet you could probably guess which artist you think this is. If you said Claude Monet, you're right. So you could then begin to make an argument. It has the same color palette. It has the same approach to brushstrokes. Takes basically a very typical subject. This is a view of the Palace of Westminster on the Thames. That basically has no historic meaning, but basically creates a mood of light on surface that really is what Monet was all about. So that is a similar skill that we'll work on all year. We'll always be looking at thematic connections between two works, like those of political propaganda and point of view. When you take two pieces of sculpture, you're going to get very different reads because there are content and formal clues about each one to tell you what's going on. On the left, you guys who've had Latin probably already know the Augustus of Prima Porta. So we have a lot of visual imagery on his breastplate there to tell us who he is and why he's important. On the right, if you know your U.S. history, then you'll recognize George Washington. And this is his state portrait in the rotunda at the state capitol in Richmond. It basically uses some Roman imagery and iconography to show that he too is a military leader, but it has a much different feel because we see him in civilian clothing as well as his military garb. And it shows you that he intends to surrender his military power and become a man of the people. So learning how to read the iconography or the messages of symbolism that you see in each piece, that's really where we spend a lot of time in art history. We'll also talk about the thematic connections between man and nature in this beautiful Chinese wall hanging. It's about 8 feet tall, shows you a relationship between man and nature that we're supposed to understand and meditate on as a viewer. Probably looking at this going, Mr. J, wait a minute, man and nature, there's no man in here. Well, that's where I step in and show you in the very lower part of the panel, you see a few people with donkeys who are laden with bags moving into the landscape you might not have noticed before. The message of the story, of course, is that man is dwarfed by nature and that nature should be the guide. When you compare that to a work from later Chinese history, this is Mao Zedong. This is Chairman Mao en route to Anwan. It shows you a very different kind of feel in that now man dwarfs nature. Man is bigger than nature, and nature has kind of been relegated to the lower part of the picture. So putting those works side by side, I think you can see there's been a dramatic shift in political thinking, and the artwork is basically telling us so. When we continue on, you're going to see that we bring this all the way to the current day. Here is the portrait or a detail from the portrait of Malala Yousafzai that was done by Shirin Neshat. You can see her looking at the portrait in the National Portrait Gallery in London. And when the two of them met, you can see here, it was kind of mutual admiration. Malala Yousafzai, you know, is a champion of education for girls facing off against the Taliban. Basically, same kind of thinking here from Shirin Neshat, as she is a person who lived before before the Iranian Revolution in 1979 and returned to the country afterwards, noting that was very different. And she chooses to use art as a weapon. So we will be bringing all of these themes forward in the course and talking about how art is very much a part of the world around you so that you know how to recognize it and see. There is a lot to the course that we can talk about, and most of it changed in 2015 and 2016. Prior to that time, it was a really challenging ordeal to get through the year in art history. Students would show up on day one, and we would literally feel like we were already 5 chapters behind because we didn't know what was going to be on the test. We had a general idea, as you can see on the screen, but very little of it was going to be global. Most of it was going to be somewhere in Europe or America, but it could literally be any of the 1,000 images you would find in our textbook. So we had very little guidance. It was always a guessing game. It was very challenging, and it only really allowed us to know a little bit about a lot of different artworks, but that changed in 2015, 2016. We basically have now narrowed the works down to 250 artworks that are spread across the globe, and we know specifically which works and how much for each content area. We also have been given, as of 2019, a nice group of tangible concepts and measurable outcomes that really guide lesson design. So we know that what we're working on in class is actually what we're going to be facing on the day of the exam. That means that when I see you guys in August, I already know what's going to be on the test. There's no guessing involved. It's going to be these 250 works and questions that we will have practiced all year long. So the exam should feel just like another day to you, which is the point all along. It is a lot of fun. We get to do field trips. We get to do lots of things, always tied to what we need to know for the exam. But I think students have a great time along the way, as you can see here. It's just a fun environment to be in. So I hope that gives you just a little taste of what's going on. Some of the other pages you're going to see before you make your decision will help you more with the logistics. But this is the nature of what we are, and I hope that we get to see you be a part of it in the fall.